Really appreciate you joining me and sitting down today to chat all things strategy on our Strategy Unscripted series. Maybe to start with, you could just give me a little bit of an introduction to yourself, your career journey, and the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me in. It's great to meet you after connecting a few months ago. So I'm currently CEO of McKinney Rogers, and I've been in that role for 5 or 6 years. I joined the business in around 2010 and joined actually from one of our clients. And through that time, I've been working both in the US and been based back in the UK, leading the business, and about 5 years ago was invited to take over the leadership of the firm. And in my early career, again, spending a bit of time both on the corporate side, but also in the consultancy market. So it's great to be here.
And as you said, you've played both roles, and you've sat on the consulting side and also on the corporate side as well. What's been the experience of both of those? How does that differ? How is it similar? What are the learnings from each?
Well, to be fair, I've spent more time on the client side than I have in terms of actually being in a corporate environment. But I think there's a couple of factors. So one is obviously at a much earlier stage in my career, when you're sort of an emerging leadership position, as opposed to the kind of work we're doing now in the last sort of 10, 15 years of work. But I think it's just around looking at the levels of productivity, the level of alignment, the level of clarity within an organisation, and actually seeing some of those key gaps around performance, and really then being able to practically see how do these initiatives that we're working on, that you work on in your business, but how do they land within an organisation, and how do you drive that level of clarity and ownership within an organisation, aligned to the vision or aligned to the mission of the business, and creating that narrative or that connective thread across an organisation from the board down to the front line.
Absolutely. Let's take it back then to a little bit earlier in your career. How did you cut your teeth? Were you always working within the strategy space? What did that look like for you?
No, not at all. I think it's quite fun. I actually started in recruitment.
Okay.
And so when I came out of university and joined a graduate training program of a very dynamic, fast-moving, high-growth business, which actually was supporting the professional services, while we had a practice dedicated to sort of search within that space. And so it became a very a very good environment to cut your teeth, and working as a research sort of associate, and then it was very much an up or out culture where you got promoted or you didn't.
As is often the case in recruitment, I think.
And but then working on the retained search side and focusing initially primarily in the sort of the professional services world with some of the sort of the leading brands in that particular market, and got to meet some really fascinating leaders, and then began to sort of diversify into the corporate world, and did some quite interesting sort of general management level searches for those businesses. So it gave a very much of an international outlook, because the searches we were running were global. And again, as quite an aggressive, fast-paced sort of high-growth company, it was a good place to be. And that business got acquired by a sort of multi-service human capital management business, and that gave me probably exposure into sort of a more kind of the strategy consulting environment, where there was one particular partner who I was sort of dying to get on one of his projects, and eventually sort of succeeded and made sort of junior partner by that stage. So I was in a more of a client management role, sort of managing 2 or 3 relationships, but wanted to sort of get involved in this kind of the consulting piece, I suppose, doing the work I'd been recruiting for, as opposed to doing the recruitment, actually doing the work. And so got this project and was really excited, etc. And went up to the client. It was in Leeds, and sort of
glamorous start.
Say again?
Glamorous start.
It was very glamorous, yeah, exactly. And the nice side of Leeds, though, so it was very good. And then I remember coming back and sort of submitting my sort of first week insights and sort of review, and basically just getting a big kind of so what in red, and being sort of feeling pretty demoralised and thinking, okay, how am I going to have just blown it, in terms of with the sponsorship and guidance. But it was probably still a really important lesson from that sort of more senior, leader who'd been doing this for 25, 30 years, to get that sort of the brutal feedback in terms of, well, what's that telling? What implication does that have for this particular engagement or this client strategy, etc. So that was probably how I cut my teeth, and then I suppose the rest is history, as they say.
And then fast forwarding to today and McKinney Rogers, can you maybe just give a little bit of background to the organisation, the specialism of the organisation, and the type of work that you do today?
Exactly. So McKinney Rogers, MR, is a execution agency. So we focus on business execution or strategy execution. So it's really working with clients to help translate, to build the vision and build the direction of the organisation. But critically, it's actually closing the gap between the strategy, the actions and the results. And so we spend a lot of time with our clients, both helping to shape and define the strategy if it doesn't exist, or if it's inherent, already existing, and it's maybe being refreshed, or maybe another consulting firm has been involved, or the team itself has been involved in developing, helping actually to operationalize it and really understand what are the disproportionate areas of focus that we really need to focus on or build on, and how do we translate that. So in terms of the sort of the core areas, the philosophy behind our work is from mission leadership, mission command, which originates from the military, and is really applying that military approach into a commercial context. So it's around defining the strategic direction of the business, it's around understanding through this focus of mission command, how do you translate the strategy, and how do you translate that at different levels of the organization so individuals understand their individual parts in their plan, and then from that process of alignment to shift then into execution to really manage the operating rhythm or cadence of the business performance reviews, and beyond that, pressure testing certain aspects of the plan, either through wargaming or through operational rehearsals to actually physically pressure test the plan in a simulated environment. And in support of the cadence and the performance management, then also really thinking around the leadership behaviours and understanding how the culture and the behaviours of the organisation supports the execution and ambition of the strategy.
Yeah. You mentioned it, a lot of that comes from a military mindset or military frameworks. Was there an origination of that within the business previously for yourself? How did that come about?
Well, you can probably tell by my physique that I don't come from that background myself, but I'm very privileged to work with a number of leaders who have spent time in that world. And as you correctly pointed out, the founders of the business come from that. The sort of the source of that, the provenance or governance of the organisation is from the British Royal Marine. And that said, we've worked with colleagues from the Dutch Marines, the US Special Forces and military, a number of colleagues over the last 15, 20 years who have come from that world and continue to do so.
I have a family member of mine who's currently at Sandhurst and going through that process, and it's amazing how many similarities there are. And obviously it's in a very, very different setting and very, very different environment, but tons of similarities between that, the business and corporate world, and obviously the background that I come from as well, which is sport. Diving back into the topic of strategy, so often, in my opinion, it's a pretty fluffy topic, or it can be a very fluffy topic, and you hear people say we need to focus on strategy, we need to think more strategically, we need to better execute the strategy. What does strategy actually mean to you in the context of business strategy?
Fundamentally, it's choices. So you establish an ambition, a direction, North Star, a Mars, a Moon, or an Everest, whatever your analogy you want to choose, and really define what are the critical shifts that your organisation needs to deliver in order to achieve that outcome. And by defining not just the ambition, but also defining the measures of success which accompany that based on your analysis and based on your understanding of the marketplace, the competitive, the regulatory, the competitive landscape, etc. Defining what is the framework that supports that. So in order to eliminate the fluffiness that you talk about, how do we clarify that outcome with those clear KPIs and understand, well, in order to achieve that over the next, let's say, short-term strategy, we're not talking 20, 30 years sort of macro show, we're talking sort of an Olympic cycle, let's say, in the next 3 to 4 years. What are the choices that we need to make? And how do we ensure that with those key bets or those critical outcomes that we need to achieve, how do we align the organisation behind that? How do we ensure we approach it at the right level of resource and focus, investment, etc., in order to be clear on those choices and make sure that we don't get distracted by some of the noise in the system, and really help the organisation understand what are the critical interdependencies in order to achieve that, what do we need to do differently, and how do we communicate that across our organisation.
And we've been digging into similar topics recently. Obviously there's a ton of alignment and synergy and similarities in terms of the work that we do, which is great. And so we've been speaking with a lot of CEOs, MD, strategy directors on the topic of strategy and strategy execution. For you, from the outside looking in, what do you see to be the big, visceral, keeping you awake at night pains of a business leader sitting in an organisation thinking about, or trying to execute strategy? What are they really struggling with?
Maybe what they're not struggling with, but in terms of the mindset, it's really thinking about how do we grow, how do we win, how do we transform. So if you're thinking about the context of your business and where you're operating, clearly there's always a growth outcome that you're trying to achieve, and you're clearly trying to win market share or you're competing against organizations with a similar will to lead and grow in a certain space, but also understanding the speed and velocity of transformation, obviously. And I think the key point, coming back to your question, is the ability to adapt. Because when you establish a goal, a strategic ambition, you're creating a path or a view of where you want to get to. And clearly, as you start executing, stuff happens.
Things will change.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of how do you adapt to the chemical reactions that happen, whether that's through conflict, which we're seeing at the moment, impacting supply chain, impacting all those aspects.
Tariffs.
Yeah, which we're seeing at the moment, and the multiple knock-on effect of tariffs across multiple jurisdictions.
Definitely.
How do we adapt? So the key point for me, I think there's probably two skills. One is this whole capability around critical thinking, and how do you build that critical thinking capability deeper in an organization in order to enable your teams to adapt at pace. Of course, correct.
And then what are the biggest roadblocks, the biggest challenges for business leaders, for mid-level management to actually take the plan of action, and put it into action, execute effectively? What's stopping them doing that? Because that's, where yourself and ourselves and others come into support.
Yeah, we as a firm, we don't do the strategy. Mm-hmm. We're asking the right questions. We're establishing a framework, a foundation, a series of experience which enables a leadership team to become co-architects of that vision. And we believe that typically drives greater level of ownership and understanding. In terms of the communication of a strategy, however hard you communicate, creating that shared understanding is key. I guess some of the barriers or the constraints is how do you drive that level of accountability, that empowerment, the freedom in a framework to really let leaders let go of decision making, so you can really drive that down, decentralize it. You have a centralized strategic intent, the leaders or commanders' intent, but the ability to empower individuals at multiple levels of the organization deeper in the business to really understand their part in the plan and give them the accountability and freedom in a framework to go and get things done. And stopping people from there's a vulnerability point, obviously, around trust, but actually stopping some leaders from telling people how to do their jobs, but just you've given them an opportunity, they've been through a selection process, let them get on with it, give them the space to lead. And
on that exact note, if I turn the mirror around a little bit and put you in the position as someone who's leading a business which is global with many different roles, functions, layers of the organization, how do you go about effectively cascading the strategy down through the organization and ensuring that those same values and principles that you're talking about and implementing with clients are implemented internally?
Sure. Well, we drink our own Kool-Aid from that perspective, and the process which we adopt internally is the exact same process. We're a smaller organization, so clearly from a scale perspective, we're not the same size as our client organizations, but from a philosophical position, we adopt the same process in terms of establishing that clear intent, establishing the direction, and I would hope, but probably my team would be the litmus test, giving them the level of empowerment to go and make things happen.
And what would you say the 3 or 4 most common band-aids, solutions to those big strategic challenges that we identified before? What would you say those are when we speak specifically about strategy execution, when we think specifically around how do we go and make this happen within an organization? What are the couple of core solutions that you look to put in place? You spoke before about people, you spoke before about clarity of communication.
So there are a certain number of principles that support mission command around leaders' intent, around clarity, around understanding, etc. But in terms of actually the elements that we talk about, you're creating a system. So very simply, we leverage technology. So there's a dashboard tool which basically is the way in which you monitor and track and align and cascade an organization's plan, and then that becomes the crux of how you manage the operating, the battle plan, and that isn't just a sort of a cascade tool, but it also becomes a way that you equip leaders to take accountability for actually sitting back and saying, am I on plan? Am I on mission, or am I off mission? And by understanding the key levers and drivers behind your individual mission, which fits into the larger organization, it's driving that understanding and awareness of, right, why? What is this telling you? Why are you on plan? Why are you off plan? What is the root cause behind it? So you're building your course corrective actions based on the symptoms, based on the insights of what's causing perhaps a deviation from the plan based on either consumer activity or supply chain issues or whatever the situation may be.
And on that note, when we think about that layer of the organisation from experience, and I think we've seen one of the biggest challenges is galvanising the team, galvanising the individuals that will ultimately have to execute upon a strategic plan, whether that's in marketing or sales, operations or HR, wherever they may sit.
Sure.
And we always speak about accountability, people feeling ownership, but actually that can be an uncomfortable thing for people. And being held accountable to their targets, their objectives, their contributions to a strategic plan can be an uncomfortable place to sit, especially if people haven't experienced that previously. Is that something that you see? Yeah,
there's a vulnerability without a doubt, that if you say I'm off mission, that people are sometimes reluctant to do that because there are policies and systems, etc. But if you're building an organisation which is based on trust, and you've got a team which is working hard towards the pursuit of a common goal and understanding the key critical independencies that you need to deliver, then we're not here to call that out. We're here to, I don't mind if you're off plan, providing you've got a plan to get back on mission.
You're recognising it early and you're addressing it.
Exactly. And being able to leverage all the data and tools that are available to us to cut through the noise and really understand why is this happening. I mean, typically we often refer to sort of the three gaps of execution. So the alignment gap, which is the difference between what we said we were going to do and what we're actually doing. And there's the knowledge gap, which is both a reference to the knowledge we have versus the knowledge we need. So that could be based around capabilities, but also it could be just down to simple leadership and effective communication and making sure people are informed within a sort of all-informed network. And then importantly, the effects gap. So the difference between the effects we planned this would have versus the effect that it's actually happening. That creates tension in both ways. If it's uber successful, then obviously it creates a supply challenge. If it isn't landing because a regulatory impact or a competitor got there first, whatever, then we've got to understand, how do we think about this from a different lens? How do we leapfrog and sort of find another way to deliver the outcome we've committed to?
What are the common traits of the individuals, the business leaders and the organisations that do this and do it really well?
That's a great question. And I think fundamentally it's around the leader's commitment. So if I look at the leaders that we've worked with, about to have breakfast with a former client today, we've not worked together probably for 6 or 7 years, and he referenced, when I even after you left 5 years ago, I go into a meeting and I can tell who's been McKinney Rogerized, in the sense that the way they set up a meeting, the way they establish the aim, the way they establish the sort of the conditions and framework for decision making, you can tell that they've spent time with you or your team over the last 10, 15 years, etc. So there is that element. So I'd say leaders' commitment. And I think where we have been successful, if I look at the transformations that we work on, and where clients typically, whether they've been through a transition, they've taken on a new leadership role, or they've been promoted, or they're going to another organisation, they pick up the phone, they understand the elements. Now they understand the elements of what makes successful execution and the value that we bring to an organisation. And there are some leaders who, for them, it's not for them, and they want to use a different approach or a different system or a different technique in order to help them, and that's great. But in terms of the core elements, comes to the commitment of the CEO to see it through, and the ability to make bold choices, to deliver bold, to establish a very bold ambition, and to work closely with their team, because we're not there all the time. We come in at critical moments of the sort of the operating and the planning processes. But we're there as a kind of a silent partner in many ways to help those leaders create a legacy for themselves and those around them in driving the kind of transformations that they've been very successful in delivering.
Through your work, your travelling and everything else that's around that, what do you read, what do you consume to stay up to date and on top of a very, very fast changing world?
Sure.
Whether that's AI, whether that's geopolitical events, or whether that's just staying on top of your craft, which in this case is business strategy and execution.
So privilege, I'm sure we can both recognise, is the networks that we have, and as you mentioned, there's a downside to travel in terms of being away from family for weeks at a time and every week, but the privilege of being able to travel and meet people and spend time socially with clients, over dinners, and understanding their views on different events, both personal but also commercial and broader, gives you that edge of diversity, of thinking, of perspectives. And so clearly I learn as much from every meeting I go to, to every podcast or article that I read. And so that's, for me, is probably the biggest learning in terms of the people I meet, the people I spend time with. Outside of that, then I think there are certain, podcasts or articles that you kind of try and stay on top of in terms of, the rest is ... and there's various elements that sort of target our kind of profiles and keeping us informed and giving us kind of objective perspectives of what's happening in the world.
Of course. If you think 5 or 10 years into the future in terms of the ever-changing landscape, specifically of business strategy, and of course there's disruption and changes as there is in any function or any walk of life. And I don't mean specifically for McKinney Rogers or Strategy in Action, but for the practice of business strategy as a whole. What changes do you see currently occurring, and what changes do you predict over the next 5, 10, 15 years even?
It's a great question. It's a frightening question, but at the same time, I think it's exciting, because I think the way in which we can leverage, obviously, machine learning and data and artificial intelligence, and obviously with the shifts in quantum computing, etc., which we're beginning to read about and understand the implications of problem solving. I remember I was on a flight recently, and it had been the Christmas break. I'd been off for sort of a week, and I'm thinking, what's my password? And the time it took, whilst I was listening to a podcast on quantum computing, I thought in the time it took me to remember my password, these computers can, solve all sorts of problems in a nanosecond of time, and I'm still struggling. That sort of demonstrates, firstly, the sort of human limitations. But I think with the advancement of technology going through a different sort of era and epoch of kind of transformation and speed, it will give us access. It will give us a competitive edge, but to everyone. So it's democratic, but obviously it's how you apply and use that to your own competitive advantage. But I think within the context of formulation and execution, there will be the emergence of new tools which will transform how we do things. There still needs to be a human element, I believe firmly, especially around learning and around leadership and creating memorable experiences to be able to engage and motivate and inspire individuals.
So ultimately it still comes down to people. It still comes down to the individuals who need to deliver.
There's a human plus AI.
Definitely.
That's relevant for early 2025. I'm sure that the language will evolve as quickly. But in terms of, some of us, if we don't get up to speed with the compound effect of human behaviour plus sort of machine learning AI, then that will be sort of, I think, one of the elements that will create the winners and the losers, and who are sort of the forward thinkers in that particular space. But in aspects also, it will make the world more democratic, so that in many respects a smaller organisation like yours or mine actually have it levels the playing field in some elements.
Yes, yeah, definitely so. Look, as I said, I don't want to keep you any longer. Really appreciate the time, really appreciate the opportunity to have a very, very insightful chat, and look forward to speaking more.
Thank you.
Thanks.